Everyone. Hopefully you all can hear me. Thank you, Nick, for a great intro. So I'm Caitlin Herr. I've been with Eversource for just a little over 2 years now, and I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. So Jacob Goldman is the Chief Engineer and Vice President of Energy Tax Savers. He has a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from the University of Buffalo and an MBA from the University of Maine at Orono. He is the co-author of numerous articles published by various institutions and magazines, and he has presented to hundreds of corporations, firms, and national conferences. Thank you, Jacob, for taking the time to present on the Inflation Reduction Act at our Zero Net Energy Conference today. And as a heads up to our audience, as Nick was saying, please do use the Q&A function to send in your questions throughout the presentation. Jacob and I'll be chiming in throughout the presentation as the questions come in so that he can answer them kind of one at a time rather than all at the end. So don't hesitate, excuse me, if you have any questions. And without further ado, Jacob can pop in.
So my video is not coming up. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to get my slides up on the screen. And don't hesitate to ask questions right then and there. If you have a question, put it in the chat, and we'll get to it when there's a pause. On the screen right now, you'll see the items that I'll be talking about. But on the right, if you were to take out your phone and take a picture of that QR code, it'll auto-generate an email, and you'll be able to get a copy of these slides. So don't hesitate to take out your phone, take a picture of that QR code, and then it auto-generates an email. Just hit send, and we'll get you a copy of these slides. I think you're going to like them. There's a lot of websites with really long names. So if you want access to those websites, you're definitely going to want to get a copy of the slides. The presentation today, we're going to mainly be talking about alternative energy credits called Section 48, sometimes called the investment tax credit. In a couple of years, in 2025, many of those credits transition over to Section 48E. We'll talk about that. We'll then get into 5-year makers and bonus depreciation, which is a form, the value of bonus depreciation, the value of depreciation is a concept called time value of money. So we'll talk about that, which dovetails perfectly into 179D, the Inflation Reduction Act enhanced 179D. And so we'll talk about those enhancements. And lastly, both Section 48 and Section 179D have elements that require prevailing wage and apprenticeship. Those are two separate requirements, prevailing wage and apprenticeship, and we'll talk about those two requirements and what those requirements entail. And with that, this is your last chance to take a picture of that QR code. If you want copies of the slides, it'll auto-generate an email, and we'll send you copies of the slides if you send me an email. So the Inflation Reduction Act has a number of incentives. I think there's like 26 different tax incentives that are created in the Inflation Reduction Act. And it lists all those incentives. I'm only going to be speaking on the incentives in green. So there are incentives that I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about sustainable aviation fuel. There's a tax credit for putting in EV charging stations, this one here, Section 30C, not talking about those incentives. My discussion is only going to be on the items in green. I know a little bit about some of these other ones, but I don't know anything about aviation fuel credits, for example. So this discussion will be mainly about the items in green. And with that, we'll get right into Section 48. Section 48 has been around in the tax code for a while. Some of you might be aware that there's been a historic solar credit. If you went back 5 years ago, the solar credit would have been 30%. And the ground source heat pump credit would have been 10%. The IRA, it's believed that it increased these credits. That's not 100% true. In some cases, it drops down to what's called the base credit. So that 30% solar credit has a base credit of 6%, but then there's a number of bonuses. And depending on if you do the right type of project with the right type of equipment in the right location, those bonuses could get you all the way up to 70%. So the old credit was 30%. The new base credit is 6%, but there's a number of bonuses that can get you all the way up to 70% for solar. For ground source, combined heat and power, thermal energy storage, it maxes out to 50%. So if you do the right things, you start at 6, and then if you do the right bonuses, you get all the way up to 50%. Ground source CHP thermal storage, the reason those are in bold is because those are the only technologies that can both qualify for the ITC and the topic we're going to talk about later, which is 179D, the tax deduction. For clarity, Section 48, the investment tax credit, is a credit. A $1 credit is worth $1. Section 179D is a tax deduction. A $1 tax deduction is worth, in the first year, it's dependent on what your tax rate is. So if you're a C Corp, your tax rate is probably at 21%. So a $1 tax deduction is worth 21 cents. So credits typically are better than deductions, but ground source, combined heat and power, and thermal storage, each one of those technologies can qualify you for both. You can use both the ITC, the Section 48, and 179D. And just imagine your ground source project in the past could get a 10% credit. Now, potentially, you could get a half off sale for ground source. Tremendously valuable. Thermal storage, for example, thermal storage never had a tax credit. The Inflation Reduction Act created a tax credit for thermal storage. So if you could justify a thermal storage project with a 0% credit, imagine what you could do with a 30% credit or 40% credit or a 50% credit. Tremendously valuable for the people that are implementing thermal storage projects or thinking about implementing thermal storage projects or ground source projects or CHP projects. So tremendously valuable. The base credit is 6%, but if you meet the bonuses can give you all the way up to 70% for solar and wind and 50% for all the other technologies. Very valuable. So before we get into the bonuses, we're going to talk about Section 6417, and this is transformational legislation. Sometimes I feel like I'm Oprah Winfrey, because you know how Oprah said, you get a car, you get a car. Well, with Section 6417, if you're a not-for-profit, you can get a tax credit. If you're a state or local government, you can get a tax credit. If you're in the Tennessee Valley Authority, you can get a tax credit. If you're on Indian tribal lands, you can get a tax benefit. It's tremendously powerful. These entities that could not get tax incentives in the past now get this elected pay, this direct pay. They'll get a check in the mail. So now the one entity type that does not get a check in the mail is federal projects. There is no Section 48 direct pay or elected pay for federal projects. This 6417 allows it for state and local governments and not-for-profits. Those are the main categories, and then you see some of the other categories below there. Now, in order to get this direct payment, this elected pay, you have to pre-register. The IRS has not developed a pre-register website yet. There's going to be a website. You're going to have to go on that website, and you're going to have to pre-register your project. Now, when I say pre-register, I don't mean what you think pre-register means. Your project actually has to complete, and only after it completes can you pre-register for the tax credit. So you're pre-registering for the tax credit. You pre-registered, they're going to give you a registration number. That registration number is what you have to put on your tax filing to actually file and get the direct payment. So there is a pre-register requirement. Because there's this special way to get tax incentives just for not-for-profits and state and local governments, there are two potential haircuts. So the bottom one here, for example, state and local governments oftentimes use tax-exempt bonds. If you're using a tax-exempt bond to pay for your project, then there could be up to a 15% haircut on the tax credit. What does that mean, 15% haircut? So if you qualified for a 40% credit, if you go back to this list here and you qualified for a 40% credit for, let's say, a ground source project, A 15% haircut would reduce it by 15%, meaning by 15% times 40%, which is 6%, it would reduce it down to a 34% credit. So that's what the haircut is for a tax-exempt bond. There's another haircut, and this has 3 ways to avoid the haircut. If your project's less than a megawatt, you avoid the haircut. There's not a 10% haircut. If you meet the domestic content requirement, which we're going to talk about shortly, even if you're above 1 megawatt, you avoid the haircut. And lastly, if you start your project this year, you avoid the haircut. So every project that you start this year avoids the haircut. Every project under 1 megawatt avoids the haircut. And every project that meets the domestic content bonus avoids the haircut. So there's 3 different ways you can avoid this 10% haircut. If you qualify for a 30% credit, the haircut is 3%, taking your 30% down to 37%. That's how those haircuts work. Those haircuts are only for 6417. It's only for not-for-profits, and it's only for state and local governments. Those are the potential detriments if you're a state or local government or not-for-profit. If you're a commercial taxpayer, there's no haircuts. There's no haircuts for just your regular commercial project. The haircuts only exist for not-for-profits and state and local governments.
Hey, Jacob, we have 2 questions.
Sure.
The first one, I think they are referencing the previous slide.
Okay.
First, can you please explain the meaning of the percent for AEC 48? Is that the percentage of the total project cost?
So it is not the percentage of the total project cost, it's the percentage of the eligible project cost. So let's say you're putting a ground source heat pump into a new building, a new construction building. It's not the whole new construction building that gets the tax credit. It's only the costs related to the ground source system. So it's the eligible project cost, not the entire project cost, assuming you're talking about a new construction type situation. Solar oftentimes is a retrofit, is after the market. So if you put solar on the roof, typically it's 98-99% of the project cost is eligible project cost, and that percentage is applied to that eligible project cost. Good question.
Great, thanks. And then what is thermal storage?
So thermal storage is a technology where you can make ice during the night. So nighttime pricing can be cheaper. Utilities can charge a cheaper rate in some areas for nighttime electricity use. And so you make ice during the night, and then you use the ice to cool your building during the day. That's one technique. There's thermal storage using water. They put these giant tanks and you cool water during the night, and then you use that water to cool your building. You can even do it the opposite way. You can do it as a heating process. You can heat water and use the heat, or you can heat sand. But the most common is these ice tanks, where you make ice during the night and you use that ice to cool your building during the day. So that's the most common thermal storage.
Great. Here, we got 2 more, actually, if you don't mind, we get through those, I guess, before we move on.
Sure.
They've come in since. First, what is the definition of the start of a project? For example, ground source heat pump installation will begin construction prior to the new building construction.
Yeah, so I'll answer briefly. I do get into it a little later.
Okay.
You actually have to either spend 5% of the project cost. That's a safe harbor. So 5% of the ground source project cost has to be expended, and you have to have continuous activity at the site. That's one way you can meet start of construction. The other way is that you're actually doing construction at the site on the ground source. In most ground source cases, it means drilling boreholes. If you're drilling the boreholes and then you're doing continuous construction after that, that would meet the start of construction. Things like design does not meet start of construction. Things like site improvement, site work, just to get the site ready is not, they specifically state, is not start of construction. But for ground source, if you're going to drill holes in the ground, that would be considered start of construction.
Great. And then finally, before we'll move on, I understand that the ground source heat pump credit also applies to all of the connected systems, such as the fan pumps and duct work, to get the conditioned air to the spaces. Is that correct?
So we have a slide on that, and
Okay.
it can be correct is the short answer. It can be correct in certain circumstances.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So to put my Oprah hat back on, wait, there's, you get a tax credit as well. So not for profits, we already talked about how they get a tax credit, and state and local governments, we talked about how they get a tax credit. But what if you're a taxpayer and you just don't owe any taxes? These credits are not refundable. So what can you do? So 6418 comes to the rescue here. 6418 allows taxpayers. It is not available for not-for-profits. It is not available for state and local governments. It's only available for tax-paying entities. Those entities, if they happen not to be paying taxes, they can use 6418 to sell their tax credits. And we've already found 5 different platforms out there, and they're listed here down on the bottom, where these marketplaces will allow you to post your tax credit, and it'll go out into the marketplace, and someone will bid on purchasing your tax credit. You'll be able to sell your tax credit. Now, they claim tax credits are typically selling in the 80 to 90 cents on the dollar. So nobody's going to pay you $1 for a tax credit. They're going to want a discount. So that discount typically looks like it's going to be in the 80 cents to the 90 cents on the dollar. But if you're not paying taxes, this might be a good way for you to bring money in for your project. And that money comes in tax-free. And where this is most interesting, the most interesting part about this is real estate investment trusts. If you have heard of REITs, REITs don't pay taxes, so they've never been able to benefit from these tax credits without using like a PPA sort of situation. Now they can directly sell their tax credits and get that check, and that check is not taxable, and it doesn't go against their ratios. REITs have these certain ratios that they have to keep in order to maintain tax-free, and it doesn't affect those ratios. So very valuable now for the for-profit entities that happen not to be paying taxes. You can go to these 5 sites, and you could put your tax credits up for sale. But once again, you do have to pre-register. Pre-register is required. IRS is going to open up a platform where you can put in your information to pre-register. Once again, you have to finish your project first, and then you're pre-registering for the credit. Then you're going to get a registration number. That registration number is what you're going to use for the actual filing in order to transfer your tax credit to someone else. So that's the items that you need to know. And 6418 is what brings this about. So very powerful legislation that allows the transfer. Does not allow the transfer for state and local, does not allow the transfer for not-for-profits. But if you're a for-profit entity, you can transfer your tax credits using this technology, this technique, 6418. So here we go into the bonuses. When I talk about these bonuses, I feel like I'm in an infomercial. Wait, there's more. So the first bonus, there's 3 easy ways to qualify for the 5-time bonus. So the way you qualify for the 5-time bonus is, once again, are you under 1 megawatt? If you're under 1 megawatt, you get the 5-time bonus. For those of you that have projects that have already started, if you started your project before January 29th, you get the 5-time bonus. These are an or. These are all an or. There's 3 separate ways that you can qualify for the 5-time bonus. Now, ground source is not measured in megawatts. Thermal storage is not measured in megawatts. It's not a common way to measure those technologies. So we've done some math on Google, and we've come up with 1 megawatt equals 284 tons. So if your ground source project is less than 284 tons, we are confident that you qualify for the 5-time bonus. Now, the ground source industry is lobbying IRS to move that number not from 284 to 444. They feel they've done some calculations, and they feel that 444 is the correct number. I feel 284 is a slam dunk. And until IRS comes out and says, yes, we're going to believe the 444, I'm very nervous about one of my clients taking the 5-time bonus if they're basing it on a project that's under 444. So definite under 284. When IRS rules on the industry's request, then we'll go with 444. But right now, 284 is good. So less than a megawatt, started before January 29th, 5-time bonus. The only other way to qualify, so let's say you started your project after January 29th, and your project is bigger than a megawatt or bigger than 284 tons. The only other way to qualify is you have to meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. you have to meet the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. And we're going to talk about, that's the last item we're going to talk about, because that same requirement is a requirement for Section 48, and it's also a requirement for 179D. So we're going to talk about that right at the end. And those are two separate requirements. Everybody seems to focus in on the prevailing wage portion, but there is an apprenticeship requirement separate, and you have to meet both. You have to meet prevailing wage and you have to meet apprenticeship. There are two separate requirements there, and you have to meet both of them. So that's the 5-time bonus. But wait, there's more. There's the domestic content bonus. So how do you qualify for the domestic content bonus? 100% of the cost of structural steel and iron of the eligible project cost of the eligible project has to be domestically sourced. 100% of structural steel and iron. Now, for ground source, there's not a lot of structural anything. You know, it does, unless you're holding something up, like let's say you're holding the heat pump up with some structure. So there's not a ton of structure. Now, solar, on the other hand, you know, the panels, the racking is structural, and that racking would need to be 100% domestically sourced steel and iron. Also, in addition to the steel and iron, structural steel and iron, 40% of all manufactured product has to be produced here in the United States. So all the pieces of equipment, the solar panel, the inverter, 40% of it has to be manufactured here in the United States. The same is true on ground source and thermal storage, all those pieces of equipment. And we're talking about all equipment. We're talking about pipes and valves and pumps. 40% of all the equipment that's eligible has to be manufactured here in the United States. This is calculated on all the qualifying equipment. So it's not like you can say, well, I'm just going to take the credit on this portion of the project and get domestic content, and the rest I won't get the domestic. It has to be for the entire project, has to meet it. Now, unfortunately, the guidance as it stands today is calculated on manufacturer's cost. So what does that mean? That means manufacturers have to release their costs to their customers, thereby releasing their profit margin. We don't think there's going to be a lot of manufacturers that do that. So we think the domestic content is a little bit of a no-go until they change it. It is our belief that IRS is going to change it. We've been lobbying for that change. We want the calculation to be done on purchase price cost, you know, the end user's purchase price of that equipment. And we think they're going to change that. In addition, we think there is a tax position to meet the spirit of the law instead of just meeting the exact guidance. Like if we can show that under the spirit of the law, you're well over 40%, then I think we'll be good. You know, just at this moment, while they're coming out with more and more guidance, there's a little bit of a disconnect because you have to do it at manufacturer's cost level, which means manufacturers have to release their profit margin basically to their customers. What is the bonus? So as I mentioned, the base credit is 6%. If you're at the base and you don't meet the 5-time bonus, then this bonus is only a 2% bonus. So 6% goes to 8%. But if you meet the 5-time bonus, the 6% goes up to 30 and the 2% goes up to 10. So now you have 40%. And many manufacturers of ground source, for example, and CHP and thermal storage, those manufacturers are here in the United States. So when IRS makes this adjustment to the guidance, many projects will likely qualify for the 40%. You know, that's a 40% off sale on your thermal storage project, on your ground source project, you know, just by using American-made equipment. Very beneficial for the thermal storage and the ground source industries. Solar, most solar is from Asia right now. There are U.S. manufacturers. You can get U.S. manufactured solar, but the vast majority of solar manufacturing currently stands in Asia. And so you'd have to really find your panels from a U.S. source in order to take advantage of this domestic content bonus. Did we get any questions on the 5-time bonus or domestic content bonus before I move forward?
Yes, 3. We'll start with, could you please clarify the third bullet up top? Projects being constructed prior to January 29th, 2023, or
Sure.
after?
So if your project started, and we already talked about what start of construction is, that's that 5% expended and continuous, or you're actually drilling in the ground for a ground source project. If your project started before January 20, and by the way, it could start in 2021, it could start in 2022, but to get these tax credits, it has to be placed in service here in 2023. But if you started your project before January 29, 2023, you're automatically at the 5-time bonus level just because you started your project before that date. And the magic of that date is because they hadn't released the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement yet. And so it's hard to meet a prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement if they didn't come out with the rules for the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. So the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement became official on January 29th. And therefore, from that date forward, if you're bigger than a megawatt, you have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. But before that date, there were no prevailing wage rules, so it was hard to meet them. And therefore, they grandfathered those prior started projects to get the 5-time bonus.
Perfect. That kind of goes hand in hand with another one. For an existing project, what's the earliest start date to qualify?
So you could start anytime, you just need to place in service. I find it hard to believe that somebody started in 2017 and then it only finished here in 2023. But as long as you're placed in service in 2023, you could start anytime before that. But once again, that start of construction also requires continuous activity at the job site. So it can't be like, oh, we started, then we had a complete shutdown and didn't do anything for 2 years. That wouldn't pass muster as start of construction.
Awesome. All right, we've gotten quite a few more. Just to be mindful of your presentation, just let me know whenever you want me to just pause on
Maybe
these.
two more.
Okay, great. Is there a way energy consultants and contractors get tax credit or other tax exemptions?
So we're going to talk about 179D, and there's an area there for 179D where you can. What I didn't talk about on this credit transfer, you could be a buyer of tax credits. So if a project occurs, you could buy those tax credits from the person, the entity doing them. So you can buy the tax credits for 80 cents on the dollar or 90 cents on the dollar. So anybody, any corporation, any company can buy tax credits. Individuals can't buy tax credits, but corporations can buy tax credits to lower their tax liability. But on top of that, 179D has a pathway for the designer to get the benefits in certain circumstances.
Perfect. Then last one before we'll just pause these. How do projects document domestic content? Will it be similar to LEED? Line item costs with backup documents showing location of manufacturing? Do projects need to go levels into the supply chain, or is it just the individual components in the system?
Yeah, so you have to get all the individual components, and you do have to dig down to the manufacturer level. The manufacturer, we have some relationships with ground source manufacturers, and their equipment is assembled here in the United States and part of it manufactured here in the United States, but they use some electronics from Asia, for example, and so they are going to have to report what is their percentage of domestic versus foreign, and that's the number that you're going to have to use. So you will have to dig down one level to the manufacturer. You have to go to at least the manufacturer. It doesn't go down 2 levels, but it does go down to the manufacturer level.
Great, thank you.
But wait, there's more. There's another bonus. There's the energy community bonus. And so the energy community bonus has 4 ways to qualify. The reason I say that is I have this one way crossed off. It's crossed off because IRS couldn't figure out how to calculate it. So they have no idea how to calculate this 5th way. And therefore it is not being shown on IRS's websites or DOE's website. So one of the ways is if you do your project on a brownfield site. And so this is the reason I said, send me an email. If you could just jot down this web address, that lists out all the brownfield sites in the United States. Notice that it is quite complicated. So if you want a copy of the slides, shoot me an email. My email address is down here on the bottom. At the end of my presentation, I'll have another QR code. But if you want these web addresses, you're going to need the slides, because there's no way you're going to be able to copy all this down. I also call this the Joe Manchin. You know, one of the ways I call the Joe Manchin bonus. The reason is if your project exists in a census tract or adjoining tract where a coal mine was closed since 2000, so where are there a lot of coal mines closed? West Virginia. So almost all of West Virginia is covered with closed coal mines that qualify almost the whole state. So if you do a project in most of West Virginia, you'll qualify for the energy community bonus. More dispersed is a census tract or adjoining census tract where a coal-fired plant was closed since 2010. So that also qualifies you for the bonus. And then an area with 0.17% direct employment from coal, oil, and natural gas and higher than average unemployment, that qualifies you as well. So once again, this is a 2% bonus. It takes your base credit up to 8%, or if you qualify for domestic, 8% up to 10%. But if you qualify for the 5-time bonus, that 2% turns into 10. And so with domestic content, that's how your 30% turns into 40%, potentially could turn into 50%. Luckily, there's a great website that DOE hosts, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in kind of the New England area right here. So this is where anywhere in green or purple is an area. Oh, sorry, wrong. Sorry, this is the correct one. This is the energy community. I was showing you the next bonus. I gave you a sneak peek of the next bonus. So this is the area that qualifies for the energy community bonus. If you're in this bluish purple or any of these orange or tannish areas, then you're in an energy community and you qualify for this bonus, the energy community bonus. And that's simply by going to that website that was on my slides. And this is what the whole country looks like, you know, throughout the country. And as you can see, most of West Virginia is covered, some of Pennsylvania, a little bit of Kentucky, and that's because of all those closed coal mines, is why those areas are qualifying. But wait, there's more. There's the low income bonus. Now, the low income bonus is different than the other bonuses. The reason it is different is you have to apply for it. And the other reason it's different, it is only for solar, wind, and battery backup attached to solar and wind. So this is the only one you have to apply for. It is limited. You know, if it's oversubscribed during the application period, then they're going to do a lottery to pass out the allocation. It comes in 4 categories. So one category is located in a low-income community. Next category is located on tribal lands. Next category is a qualified low-income residential building project. And next category is a qualified low-income economic benefit project. There's different allocation amounts. So there's 490 megawatts behind the meter and 210 megawatts in front of the meter for a 10% credit. 200 megawatts on this one for a 10% credit, 200 megawatts on this category for a 20% credit, and 700 megawatts in this one for a 20% credit. Now, there is going to be, and this slide is actually incorrect as of today, on October 19th, write this down, on October 19th, the window is going to open to apply for all of these categories. You will have 30 days to be considered first in line. Anybody that applies in the first 30 days is considered applying on the same date. We believe these are going to be oversubscribed. And so if you want to get this bonus, just to be sure, you need to be under contract to apply and not yet placed in service. So to apply, you need to be under contract and not placed in service. You then have to apply, and then you'll get an allocation after the 30-day window. You'll get an allocation. We think they're going to be oversubscribed, so it's going to be a bit of a lottery. So you'll apply for your category, and then each category will likely have a lottery, and that will divvy out who wins this 10% or 20% bonus. Now, how do you qualify? So located in a low-income community, the great part is there's a website. So this category 1 has a website, and I showed you it by accident, but anywhere in green is an area that you're in a low-income community. Just the green, the purple doesn't count for low-income community. But if you're in green, you're in a low-income community and you qualify for category 1. So if you're doing a solar project and you're under contract but not completed, you can apply for the low income bonus. That application window opens on the 19th of October, just 8 days from now. And then basically you have 30 days to get your application in. And then you'll be eligible to win that allocation of the prescribed credits. The way you qualify for some of these other ones, so local on tribal lands is governed by this US code. You're a qualified low-income residential building. So you're either covered housing, ag department housing. If you're in this category, if you think you're in a participating affordable housing program, we have the complete list. It's like 3 pages long of what qualifies as an affordable housing program. And so don't hesitate to shoot us an email and we'll take a look and share with you that list. The electricity has to be allocated equitably among the occupants of the housing, of the building. So it is important that you be aware of that the electricity has to be equitably allocated across the building, the tenants of these buildings. The same is true for this 4th category, which is qualified low-income economic benefit project. The electricity produced needs to be provided to households with income less than 200% of the poverty line or less than 80% of the area median income. That's how you qualify for this category, is that you're providing energy to people to households less than 200% of the poverty line or households less than 80%. So they're directly getting a benefit from this electricity. There has to be a discount as well to normal costs. So there's 4 different ways. Here's the allocation in megawatts. We do think it's going to be oversubscribed. We represent already, we're going to do the applications for 10%, at least 10% of category 1. So we think there's other people applying. And so we think most of these categories are going to be oversubscribed. And then this happens every year. So every year there's going to be a new tranche with these same amounts, and they'll be divvied out accordingly. The next window for opening is going to be, I think, the 2nd quarter of 2024. And once again, it's going to be a 30-day window. You're going to need to apply. You're going to need to be under contract, but not yet placed in service. And so that'll be important in order to win these allocated additional credits. Only available for wind, solar, and battery backup of either wind or solar. Any questions come in before we move on to some other topics?
Sure, let's try to get to a few. And I think I'm going to go chronologically. So these first 2, I think, are referencing a previous slide. What is the apprenticeship requirement?
So we're going to get that at the end of the presentation.
Okay, great. And then maybe you'll cover this later, but what kind of guarantee can exist for a project with ground source heat pumps that won't be complete until, say, 2027?
So the tax credit is available, and I show it on the next slide. Ground source, the tax credit is scheduled for 10 years, all the way to 2035, more than 10 years. That being said, any particular Congress could change laws. Laws can be changed. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to stay around because I think there's lots of interest in these incentives by voters. But that would be your only risk on the ground source side. And just so you're aware, there's been a ground source credit during Republican administrations, during Democratic administrations, during mixed administrations. It's been around for years. So I think it's a small risk that it would get repealed.
Great. What if you add batteries and add panels to a system placed in service in 2021? Can you get a 30% credit and bonus on standalone batteries and on added solar panels?
Yes. So it's only for the addition. You can't take another credit on the stuff you already installed. But anything that qualifies, for example, standalone energy storage qualifies, solar qualifies. So anything new that you're putting in would qualify.
Great. All right. Are you okay if we 2 more?
Sure.
Okay. Is the 20%, and I think this was on more recent slide, is the 20% on top of the 30% credit for residential solar?
The 20% is on top of it. That's why on this chart right here, you see this low income column right here. That's why these types of technologies, if you do the right project with the right equipment in the right location, you could get all the way up to a 70% off sale. Imagine you can do your solar project with 70% off, just unthinkable a couple years ago.
Great. Does the low income community bonus for EV charging infrastructure function the same way?
So there is a EV charging credit. It is not a bonus. It's if you're in a low income area, meaning that same map, if you do EV charging anywhere in the green, not the purple, but anywhere in the green, then you're eligible for, I think it's a 30% credit for EV charging. But I wouldn't call it a bonus.
Awesome. That's all for now. Thank you.
So in 2025, most of Section 48 disappears and some of it reappears as Section 48E. So ground source is the only technology that stays in 48. It's the only technology that's still available in Section 48, and that availability is out to 1/1/2035. But other technologies, like for example, CHP, combined heat and power, often uses natural gas. So combined heat and power that uses natural gas to create electricity, we think that the last year you're going to be able to take that is in 2024 for projects started in 2024. So you're going to definitely want to do your CHP projects start in 2024. Otherwise, we think there will no longer be a credit. If you start your CHP project in 2025, we don't think there'll be a credit anymore for CHP. The ones in green, we know for sure travel over to 48E. So solar, wind, battery backup, and thermal storage. And this geothermal is where you use steam to make electricity, steam from the ground. We think maybe fuel cells, but we don't know for sure. The rules for 48E aren't going to come out for probably another year or so. But the ones in green definitely will pass over to 48E. The ones in red we think are going to be dead, except ground source stays in 48 for a good long time. And then these yellow ones, they don't produce electricity, and the Section 48E is all about production of electricity. So we don't know how they're going to rule on microgrid controllers, interconnection property, and electrochromic glass. What I can say is, do those projects start them in 2024 or earlier? Because there's a chance that if you start your project in 2025, these three yellow technologies are not going to have a tax credit available to them. So Section 48 turns into Section 48E. The only thing that stays in 48, everything else gets canceled, but the only thing that stays in 48 is ground source, and then that ground source credit expires in 1/1/2035 for 48. So many things are going to transition over to 48E. So ground source, and this was an earlier question, what typically qualifies? So the bore field qualifies, the heat pump that the bore field is connected to definitely qualify. And I want to emphasize this, based on a tax interpretation that the industry has used for years, and you see the code for that tax interpretation right here. Based on that tax interpretation of a somewhat similar technology, if 75% of the energy flowing through equipment downstream of the heat pump is sourced from the ground, then that equipment is eligible for the tax credit. So if only 70% of the energy flowing through that equipment, let's say it's dual use, there's a gas boiler and it both feeds into ductwork, for example, if that happens and it's 70% from the ground and 30% from the gas boiler, then none of that equipment qualifies. But if it's over the 75%, then that percentage qualifies for the tax credit. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about pipes, ductwork, heat exchangers, diffusers, air handlers. All that downstream equipment becomes integral to the process and the use of the ground source. And using this tax interpretation, once again, is an interpretation. There's not a direct rule from IRS that says, yes, this is correct. It is an interpretation of the rules, would allow for projects downstream to qualify for the tax credit. And this is tremendously valuable because that equipment can cost almost as much as the boreholes and the heat pump. And so now you're adding, you know, if you use the conventional technology that fed into the ductwork, there'd be no tax credit. You now use ground source to feed into the ductwork, and that all automatic now becomes credit eligible because of this tax interpretation. And once again, construction must begin before 1/1/35. That, for example, if the backup system is a gas boiler, that gas boiler does not qualify at all. There's no credit. It's only the dual use equipment that uses both the ground and some other technology that if it's over 75%, then it gets a tax credit up to that percentage. Thermal storage. Thermal storage right now has 3 rules. We think there's going to be more guidance, but we don't know. We're hopeful. But right now, the guidance is directly from the tax law itself. It has to directly connect to the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning system. It has to remove heat from or add heat to a storage medium for subsequent use. And it has to provide energy for the heating or cooling of the interior of a residential or commercial building. Now, this last one's important. If you're using your thermal storage for a process load, doesn't qualify. If you're using it for a process load, it won't qualify. If you're using for a building, then it qualifies. So that's important to know, that you have to be using it for the heating and cooling of a building. What is thermal storage? It cannot include swimming pools. It cannot include combined heat and power, cannot include the structure of the building itself. Those technologies are not eligible to be considered thermal storage. For Section 48, construction must begin before 1/1/25, but then thermal storage is specifically selected to continue in 48E, in Section 48E. So it's going to be around for a good long time, and so very valuable on the thermal storage side. CHP, you know, if you're bigger than 50 megawatts, no tax credit. No investment tax credit for CHP bigger than 50 megawatts. If you're between 15 megawatts and 50 megawatts, there's a haircut, and you have to use this multiplier here. One note, CHP does not include property used to transport the energy source to the facility or distribute the energy produced by the facility. So any equipment you had to build to bring the gas in, or anything you needed to build to bring the steam or electricity out, not eligible. And then there's some efficiency requirements. So you have to exceed 60% efficiency. 20% of the energy has to be used in the form of thermal, and 20% of the energy has to be used in the form of electrical or mechanical power. So those are the requirements in order to be considered CHP. So this is a good spot to pause. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, a few people have some questions. And again, just let me know, being mindful of your time, when we can move on. Can you only apply for one of the low income categories, or can they stack?
You can only apply for one. You have to pick your category. It's very, what I would say, and you know the value of free advice, Category 1, I think, is going to be the most subscribed. So to the extent that you can be in 2, 3, or 4, apply for 2, 3, and 4. I can't guarantee that, but my sense is Category 1 is going to be the most oversubscribed.
Hi, are the years we're speaking about calendar or federal fiscal years?
Calendar years.
Great. For the fossil fuel fired project using hydrogen blending, 5%, 10%, or greater, do you know where they may land?
So it's 0%. If we're talking about the 48E, you can't use any fossil fuels. It's 0% for 48E. Did I understand that question correctly?
I believe so, and I'll let them clarify with a new question if not.
Okay.
The map shows all of Fairfield County as an energy community. Does that mean any FC project gets the 10% bonus? Also, is the percent of oil and gas employment calculated? And if the above percentage in these areas in addition to the map there? And if above the percentage are these areas in addition to the mapped areas? So
this is the map. If I'm assuming this is Fairfield County, I'm not sure. But if it is, then it's a 2% credit. But if you meet the 5-time bonus, it becomes a 10% credit. If you're in this area, every project qualifies for the energy community bonus. It doesn't matter what type of project, it qualifies. Same with this a little bit of area near New London, also qualifies for the 2% bonus. But if you meet the requirements for 5 times, it turns into a 10% bonus.
Okay, great. Could you give an example of waste heat energy recovery, and for how long will those credits be available?
Yeah, so waste heat energy recovery is not what you think it is. It is actually the use of waste heat to create electricity. You have to be creating electricity. The definition of waste heat energy recovery is not just reusing the heat, it's reusing the heat to create electricity, which I think is fairly rare, especially in a building context. So, you know, we've seen projects that do that, but it has to be in the production of electricity.
Awesome. What is the criteria for dual use, installed capacity or energy delivered? If it's energy delivered, how do they meter? Thank you.
Yeah, so we believe that modeling, energy simulation modeling, will be adequate for determining the percentages and the amount of energy that's flowing on an annual basis. That it's done on an annual basis. But IRS could take the position that you need to show it in a metered fashion, which I think basically would be some sort of calculation that you would create. There are ways that you could meter it. It would be kind of annoying and an extra cost. But we think an energy simulation model would be defendable.
Great. How about one more? There's still a few, but just do control systems and electrical service come under the tax credit for ground source?
Yes, as long as they're integral parts of that ground source system, and obviously controls would be an integral part of the ground source system, they would be eligible. Now, to the extent they also control a non-eligible system, then you'd have to bifurcate, and that 75% tax interpretation would have to be used.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Sure. Does wastewater heat recovery for domestic hot water count under thermal energy storage?
We'd have to see the exact details. Shoot me an email, show me the design. We'll see. Right now, you know, unfortunately, this is the only guide. These 3 lines, this line, and this line, are the only guidance that we have. There could be future guidance that comes out. We think potentially there'll be future guidance that comes out. So we'd have to see the system to determine whether that unique system would meet these 3 requirements. And it's possible that it does.
Oh, perfect. Ooh, sorry.
But go ahead.
That slide, last one for now. Concerning the last bullet on the CHP slide, does that mean that the supply and return piping connecting the CHP unit to the building heat exchangers does not qualify for the incentive?
We'd have to look at the design. There are certain parts that we can draw a circle around and are eligible, but clearly bringing the gas in and bringing the heat and the electricity out is not qualified. So we'd have to see the design. Oftentimes a boiler, a heat exchanger, some of those items are still inside the circle, and we'd have to see what the design looks like.
Okay, thank you.
So now we get to talk about depreciation. So we were talking about a tax credit. Now we're going to talk about depreciation. So if you qualify for the investment tax credit, if you qualify for that Section 48, your equipment magically turns into 5-year makers. You know, magically turns into 5-year makers. If you have a conventional package unit on your roof, that package unit needs to be depreciated for new construction over 39 years. You know, very slow way to depreciate. But you change that out with a ground source system, and now it magically turns into 5-year makers. 5-year makers is very valuable. It's the time value of money, and on the next chart, we'll show you how valuable the ability to depreciate faster is. On top of that, if you're 20-year makers or less, then you automatically qualify for bonus depreciation, which allows you to expense up to 1%. In 2023, that percent is 80%. In 2024, it drops to 60, then 40, then 20, then 0. We do think that Congress is going to act and probably move it back up to 100% at some time in the future. But right this second, you can expense 80% of your ITC investment tax credit projects. You can expense 80% of it, and then the remainder, that last 20%, gets depreciated over 5 years. Tremendously valuable in time value money to be able to depreciate things faster. Would you rather have $1 now, or would you rather have $1 in 39 years from now? Tremendously valuable to be able to accelerate the depreciation of assets. And any one of the technologies listed, here, any of these technologies magically becomes 5-year property and qualifies for that 80% bonus in 2023. So very valuable legislation that allows the accelerated depreciation of those type assets. And that's why you want to do these projects another reason why you want to, besides the tax credit, it's why you want to do these projects instead of conventional technologies, because of the accelerated depreciation. And what does that look like from a time value money standpoint? So let's say we have a $39,000 project using a 35% tax rate. So what is the value in today's dollars for 39-year depreciation of $1,000 a year for 39 years at the 35% tax bracket? So that's $350 a year in your pocket. What does that look like discounted at 4%? Well, that's worth $6,854. If you discount it at 8%, which is closer to the recent inflation numbers we had a year ago, it's $4,158. So very low value for depreciating over 39 years. Change that to 5 years, and now you're at 12,000. You're almost double this and almost triple this. And if you get to take it immediately, if you could expense all of it, we're talking about double and definitely triple. So there's tremendous value to be able to move things to a quicker depreciation schedule. And it's all based on the concept of time value of money. And that leads us directly into 179D, because 179D for commercial building owners is an immediate tax deduction instead of slow depreciation. The way you qualify, when you qualify for 179D, you get an immediate tax deduction. You get down here this number instead of these numbers up here, this slow depreciation. The full value on a commercial side for 179D is this time value of money, being able to expense something immediately as opposed to depreciating over time. So this is, once again, another good spot to pause. So do we have any questions at this point?
Actually, only one for now. Are the areas covered by the 0.17% oil and gas related employment in addition to the mapped area? And can the taxpayer calculate this themselves using census data, or will eligible areas be published?
So this is the eligible areas. It's these the bluish purple is the 0.17%. These other ones, like in Massachusetts, I'm assuming this is a coal-fired plant that was closed in the dark orange, and these are the adjacent tracks in the lighter tan. But this blue area is the 0.17%. And you'll see when you look at the whole map, they show the 0.17% in large swaths of the country. So it's an actual map. And I'm not saying you should just use this map. You should use other information, but this map is fairly accurate. And, if you found a spot that qualified that was not in the bluish area, I would be very suspect that it actually qualifies, because you have to be 0.17% and you have to have a higher than average unemployment.
And then before we move on, one more just came in. Can these credits be used for a manufacturing building heating system converting gas-fired boilers to ground source heat pumps?
Yes. It's for the ground source heat pump project. But yes, the ground source, the eligible equipment would be eligible for sure.
Great.
Okay. 179D. So we talked about tax credits. A $1 credit is worth $1. We talked about tax depreciation, which is the time value money. 179D on the commercial side is about time value money. It is a deduction. So to get the value of the deduction in the first year, you got to multiply by your tax rate. So it is less valuable than the credit. And once again, as I mentioned, if you're doing ground source, you're doing CHP, you're doing thermal storage, you can use both. You can use Section 48 and you can use 179D. You can use both at the same time. So it is a tax deduction for lighting, HVAC, and building envelope. Your level of deduction depends on how efficient you are. It's good for new construction. It's good for retrofit. And for commercial building owners, if you forgot to take 179D, you actually can put it on an upcoming tax return all the way back for projects started since 1/1/2006. So you can still get your 179D for projects that you finish that you forgot to take 179D. There is one really special aspect of 179D. For certain building types, the only party that can get it is the designer. So what do I mean by designers? I'm talking about architects, engineers, ESCOs, design and build firms. The designer can get this benefit for certain building types. Traditionally, 2022 and earlier, that was just government buildings. But as you'll see on the next slide, you can get this for other building types now because of the changes in the IRA. And this is one of the key changes in the IRA. So 2 commercial building owners can take it. It's an accelerated depreciation. You get a deduction now instead of depreciating over time. On the designer side, if it's a government building, the designer is the only party that can get the benefit. And now there's other building classes where that designer gets the benefit. But designers can only go back 3 years. They can only go back in their amendment window. They have to actually amend a past tax return in order to take it for prior years. We've done 16,000 buildings. This is a map of, there is some buildings we did in Alaska and Hawaii as well. But we have helped 16,000 designers and building owners, projects to get this incentive, this 179D. So what are the changes in the IRA? The changes go in effect at the beginning of this year, 1/1/2003. And that first change is the designers get the benefit now for not-for-profits and tribal projects. So if you're a designer, not only do you get it for government projects, but you also get it for not-for-profit and you also get it for tribal. And you're the only party that can get it. There is no mechanism for anybody else to get the deduction. The only party that can get it is the designer. If you know the history of 179D, it used to be 60 cents, 60 cents, 60 cents, adding up to $1.80. They had some inflation adjustments. So in 2022, it could go all the way up to $1.88. The changes in the IRA actually reduced the tax deduction. So it took that $1.80 and dropped it down to 50 cents to $1. You used to be able to qualify separately for lighting, separately for HVAC, separately for envelope. You can't do that anymore. It's more holistic. You have to model the building after your project as it stands with pre-existing equipment and also your new equipment. That has to be a 25% improvement over an ASHRAE standard when you're modeling, up to a 50% improvement. 25% gets you the low end, the 50 cents, 50% gets you the high end, the $1. If you want to qualify for the $2.50 to $5, you have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship. So once again, that requirement comes in, the 2 requirements, prevailing wage and apprenticeship. You have to meet those requirements in order to move your 50 cents to $2.50 and your $1 to $5. You'll notice that that's a 5-time bonus. It's the same bonus that you get on the ITC side. It's a 5-time bonus. So 50 cents times 5 is $2.50. $1 times 5 is $5. So prevailing wage and apprenticeship is what gets you that 5-time bonus. Now, on the ITC Section 48 side, they got that other way, less than a megawatt. 179D does not get that other way, does not get the small project exclusion. There is no definition of a small project that allows the building owner to automatically get the $2.50 to $5. They do have that January 29th still. So if you started your 179D project before January 29th, 2023, you are grandfathered into the $2.50 to $5. But otherwise, you have to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement. They did another change on retrofits and retrofits alone. There's another way. Instead of energy simulation modeling, which you can do for retrofits, you can use EUI. So you get the EUI pre-project, the EUI after the project. You compare the difference. 25% gets you the minimum, 50% gets you the maximum. Anywhere in between, you get in between. So that EUI method is only available for retrofits, but all the time you can still use the modeling method, energy simulation modeling. The last big change, and this is really important, you used to only be able to get $1.80 for the lifetime of the building. Didn't matter who owned the building for the very lifetime of the building. If $1.80 was taken, there'd be no more tax deduction. Well, now every 3 years on a commercial project and every 4 years on a government or tax exempt project, does it re-up. So for ESCOs out there who do projects multiple times at a school district, if they go back every 4 years, they can get a new tax deduction every 4 years for their project. Very valuable. That reset is very valuable, and that came out in the Inflation Reduction Act. Some simple math: 100,000 square feet times 250 could get you $250,000. Times 500,000. Once again, if you're the designer of a government building or a not-for-profit building, you get this $500,000 tax deduction just by designing energy efficiently. Once again, you do need to meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements to get these higher level, the $250 to $5. But a 500,000, make that 100,000 square foot a middle school, 100,000 square foot middle school. The designer of that middle school could get a $500,000 tax deduction just by designing energy efficiently, better than the ASHRAE standard. So very valuable legislation. What do I mean by designers of buildings? What buildings qualify? On the government side, we're talking federal military bases. On the state side, state universities. On the county, city, town side, lots of K through 12 schools. But the new categories of not-for-profits, half of all hospitals are not-for-profits. All those religious institutions, private schools, private universities. If you're the designer of those type projects, you are the only party that can get the 179D tax deduction. And then tribal, it's all those tribal government projects as well that can qualify. Did we get any questions in?
Yeah, yes, now would be a great time. The first one I'll do is, how is designer defined? Is that only the architect, or can subs such as engineering firms or energy and sustainability consultants be applicable?
So technically, it's the party that selects the technical, that creates the technical specifications on the project. So IRS loves architects that stamp something. They love engineers that stamp something, but it doesn't have to be. Like we see a lot of lighting retrofits where it's just an electrical contractor that is coming in and, deciding which LED lights to put in place of the fluorescent lights. So it's the party that selects the technical specifications. And then on top of that, you have to get a form signed by the government building owner that says you're the designer. So you need two things. A, you have to have created the technical specifications, and B, the building owner has to designate you as the designer as well. So you need to meet both those requirements.
Awesome. Then here's two questions I'll blend into one. Which version of ASHRAE 90.1 is required for the model? Is the baseline used in energy modeling still ASHRAE 90.1-2004?
So it is not 2004, it is 2007. But we have 2007, and it's going to be on our later slide. We have it until 2026. So lots and lots of projects are going to qualify because 2007 had fluorescent technology as its lighting technology. And we've also had 16 years of HVAC improvements over 2007. So we have 2007 to 2026. Unfortunately, in 2027, it turns to ASHRAE 2019. ASHRAE 2019, we did a study. We looked at 100 buildings that qualified against 2007. Only 10 buildings qualified against 2019. So many less buildings are going to qualify against 2019. The main reason for that is that LED lighting is now embedded in ASHRAE 2019.
Thank you. How can government entities get a piece of 179D on our taxpayer-funded construction projects if the tax credit goes to the design engineer, architect, or contractor? What language should we add in our contracts to share in that revenue?
So first of all, it's a tax deduction. The value of it is very complicated to calculate. What I would tell you is IRS really frowns upon this sharing of the deduction. We know that some people have been sharing, but IRS definitely frowns on the sharing of the deduction. The building owner, the government building owner, gets lifetime energy savings. And if it's a ground source or thermal storage or CHP project, they also get the ITC, the investment tax credit. But the designer is the only party supposed to get the tax deduction. We do know that sharing is happening. probably the most legal way to do this is, can you tighten your belt and give us a better quote on the buy side? But the IRS really frowns on the sharing, and there's some out there that believes that it's actually the form of a, almost to the level of a kickback, in which case it could actually be illegal, like, go to jail illegal. So we think IRS, we know that IRS frowns upon this sharing, but we do know that it exists and it's out there. And if you're going to do it, I would do it as a discount, pre-project discount, if you have to do it. But I think it borders on the illegal, and I caution you against it.
Nice. You said kickback, and that is in our next question. Can owners request a kickback of the credit from the designer for signing the authorization?
Yeah, so I think I just
yeah. We'll do one more. Do these EP Act 179D deductions qualify for new buildings and renovations?
So that leads right into this slide here. So I'll answer it by doing the slide. Okay. It depends if it's a commercial project or a not-for-profit or government project. But on commercial projects where it's a deduction in lieu of depreciation, the best parties to take this are commercial new construction and all residential greater than 3 stories, new construction or retrofit. The reason commercial non-residential building retrofits don't need 179D, in 2017, they came out with all sorts of different ways called the qualified improvement property, bonus depreciation, repair regs, and section 179. Using these 4 tax techniques, they don't really need a way to accelerate the depreciation of a non-residential retrofit. Residential doesn't get the benefit of these laws, this QIP law and the bonus. Non-residential does get the benefit. So if you're doing commercial non-residential retrofit, there's other ways to qualify for accelerated depreciation. There's no reason to use 179D. There's no reason to pay me to run energy simulation models on a building. So it's important that people know that they have other techniques for accelerating depreciation. This is only for commercial. On government and not-for-profit, any type of project, retrofit, new construction, doesn't matter. The designer gets the benefit, and very valuable for that designer. So we answered it with the slide that was in front of us. ASHRAE 2007, as I mentioned, is good for placed in service all the way out to the end of 2026. And then it goes to ASHRAE 2019. And that brings us to the prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement is also required there. We'll get that into that right at the end of the presentation. But how do you qualify? The whole building can qualify. You model your building versus the reference building. You have to show a 25% improvement over that ASHRAE 2007 standard. It is a service that we do offer. On retrofits, it's EUI. More than likely, you're going to be using Portfolio Manager. No energy simulation modeling is required, but once again, 25% improvement level in your EUI pre-project, post-project to get the minimum tax deduction. And there is no more individual system deductions. Lighting, HVAC, and envelope have to qualify all together. You can't qualify each one of them separately. You have to model the building as it stands post-project against the reference building. If it's 25% improvement, then you get the minimum. If it's 50%, you get the maximum. You do need 2 things to qualify. One, you need a project. That project has to be lighting, HVAC, or envelope based, and you need to beat a standard. Your building post-project needs to be more efficient than a standard. Between 2006 and 2015, you got to beat ASHRAE 2001. Between 2016 and 2026, you got to beat ASHRAE 2007. And then in 2027 and beyond, you have to beat ASHRAE 2019. And retrofits have an EUI method for qualifying. Only for retrofits can you do either the modeling method or the EUI method. There's a bunch of technologies that tend to qualify. Once again, as I mentioned, ground source, thermal storage, and combined heat and power get both the Section 48 ITC tax credit and also this 179D tax deduction. So you can get both. But a lot of these are grouped in areas where you do something that's different than in the reference building. So for example, the reference building for rental apartments and dorms and hotels, that reference building is going to have what's called PTAC units, you know, those things underneath the window in a typical roadside hotel. Those PTAC units are fairly inefficient. So if you happen to have a building that has central HVAC, you're going to blow the doors off of a PTAC building. So it's really about using different equipment than what's in the reference building. So that's what a lot of these technologies are. But among those, ground source thermal storage and combined heat and power get you both the credit and the deduction. And what I'll tell you is when we go to ASHRAE 2019, ground source is going to be one of the few technologies that get you over the hump. Ground source is very efficient, and it might be one of the few technologies that allows a building to qualify once we're at ASHRAE 2019. So whole building energy simulation, we need to model those buildings. It takes a lot of data to model. Ideally, we're looking for architectural, electrical, mechanical, plumbing. Even if they're outdated, we need some drawings to measure the building to see what, you know, oftentimes the insulation on the building is not going to change. So window to wall ratios typically don't change. We need even old drawings if it's a retrofit type situation. We need a listing of all the lighting. We need a listing of all the mechanical equipment. We need to understand the U values of the windows, the R values of the walls and the roof. To run an energy simulation model, you need a lot of data. So it's a lot easier to do this on new construction. But if you're retrofit, you do need to collect a whole bunch of information on the project, but also the underlying building in order to qualify. For retrofits where you're using that EUI method, we are looking for 24 months of pre-project energy bills and 12 months of post-project energy bills, and then all the energy bills during the construction period. So we're going to look for all that data on retrofits and retrofits alone. Just to reiterate, what typically qualifies on the 179D side, government and tax exempt. It doesn't matter if it's new construction or retrofit. The designer gets the benefit. It's good for new construction. It's good for retrofit. For residential greater than 3 stories, new construction or retrofit, it's good. For commercial, it's really just new construction because they have other ways to accelerate the depreciation of assets. So before I go on to prevailing wage and apprenticeship, are there any questions that popped up? The prevailing wage and apprenticeship is the last topic.
Great. This one's more hypothetical. I did an exercise for a 500,000 square foot warehouse covered by ground source heat pumps. It appears that with IRA credits and 179D, I could meet 100% of the project cost, which sounds too good to be true. Could you advise if such a scenario may be possible?
I don't think it really, like, first of all, the project cost is the project cost of the ground source. So if you happen to be in the right location doing domestic content and the tonnage is either below 284 and on top of that, you can do prevailing wage if you're bigger than 284 tons, then you get a 50% credit. That's half off. The rest of it has to be depreciated. The depreciation doesn't create money. It only creates the time value of money situation. You would have been depreciating anyways. So I'd want to look at your math. You can shoot it to me. We'd be glad to go over it with you. But I don't think it would ever cover 100% of the cost. But it would cover a goodly portion. You know, I could see 60, 70% being covered if you happen to meet all those criteria. So it would cover a goodly portion for sure.
Great. A prior slide stated that individual system projects were no longer eligible and it was whole buildings only, but there's also a list of HVAC projects that would qualify. Can you clarify?
Yes, so you don't qualify on the individual component. You have to model the entire building. But let's talk about a retrofit project. Let's say you have a building and you retrofit the lighting. We then have to model that entire building with the new lighting, the old HVAC, and the old envelope. And if that models out to a 25% improvement compared to ASHRAE 2007, that project, that lighting project, qualifies for a tax deduction. In the old rules, there's a way to isolate just the lighting and model just the lighting and no other equipment in the building. So what that means is you kind of need fairly efficient HVAC and envelope if you did a lighting project. If you just did an HVAC project, you need fairly efficient lighting and envelope in order for the whole model to show up as a 25% improvement. So a lighting project can qualify, an HVAC project can qualify, but the whole building's energy use after you do your project has to be 25% better than the ASHRAE 2007 standard in order to qualify.
Okay, thanks. Finally, if a commercial building was placed in service in 2022, but meets the requirements and 179D was not previously taken, can the designer now take the deduction?
The designer can take the deduction. They'll have to amend their tax return, but yes, if it's efficient enough, they can take the deduction for past projects. They can go back 3 years. So 2020 is, I think, the current still open tax year. So any designer that did a project in 20, 21, 22, or 23 could take a tax deduction. But if they did it in 20, 21, and 22, they'd have to amend their tax returns.
Okay. Oh, one more. For the data required, can the analysis and documents required by the Mass Save Utility programs for new construction count? Like, is there synergy to reduce duplication of paperwork?
There is some synergy, but you know, I'm not fully knowledgeable on the Massachusetts data request. But at the end of the day, we have to run an energy simulation model. So we need all the data. We need to know make and model of HVAC, VFDs on air handlers. We need a lot of data in order to model. I don't know what level of data, but send that data plus send drawings and send spec sheets. And then I'm sure we'd be able to model the building.
Thanks. That's all for now.
So prevailing wage and apprenticeship. These are the rules to get the 5-time bonus for the tax credit and the 5-time bonus for 179D. The rules are the same. You can look up the prevailing wage. There are 2 requirements. Prevailing wage is separate than the apprenticeship requirement. For the prevailing wage requirement, there's something called certified payroll. We believe certified payroll will help you meet the prevailing wage requirement. You can look up the prevailing wage for any project at the www.sam.gov website. When you look up the prevailing wage, if there's a trade category that isn't listed that your project requires, then you have to get a wage determination. The way you get a wage determination is by sending an email to this email address with this information in it, and then they will tell you what the wage is for that labor category. And you have to have records that certified payroll will have most of these records. What we don't know is, will the certified payroll also have the records required for apprenticeship requirements? And that's a separate requirement, the apprenticeship requirement. And so the requirement has kind of 2 levels and some other additional items. One is, what is the minimum amount of apprentices you have to have? So if you started your project before January 29th, you don't need any apprentices, you're exempt. If you started your project after the 29th in 2023, at minimum, you have to have 12.5% of your total labor hours coming from apprentices. And it's not any apprentice. It's an apprentice that comes from a registered apprenticeship program. Your apprentice has to come from a registered apprenticeship program. If they don't, then they don't qualify as an apprentice for this calculation. Starting in 2024, we max out at 15% of total labor hours has to come from apprentices. So you have to have apprentices at 12.5% or 15, and each apprentice, you have to prove that that apprentice came from a registered apprenticeship program. We go onto a website to see what are the registered apprenticeship programs, and we have to see that that apprentice came from one of the registered programs. Very important. Anecdotally, we're hearing that there are apprenticeship programs that are not registered, and you need to be an apprentice from a registered apprenticeship program. So that's the floor, the 12.5% and 15%, but there's also a ceiling. The ceiling is called the apprentice to journey worker ratio, and you have to have documentation that proves that you meet the apprentice to journey worker ratio on a daily basis. So what is this ratio? It's governed by most states, but it's also governed by the apprenticeship program. they don't want a situation where there's too many apprenticeships and not enough supervision, not enough journey workers supervising their work. So if a journey worker calls out sick and you're right at the line of whatever that ratio is, the apprentices have to be sent home. You have to be able to prove that you met this on a daily basis. And that's the ceiling. You have to have at least a certain amount of journey workers on site for every certain number of apprentices. And that's governed by the state, and it's also governed by the registered apprenticeship program. So there's a floor, which is this 12.5% and 15%. That you just have to prove on the total project. But then there's a ceiling, and that ceiling has to be proved. It has to be proved on a daily basis that you've met that. If you go to your registered apprenticeship program and ask for apprentices and they are unable to provide it to you, there is a good faith effort exclusion. And if they reject you or they don't respond, then you're good for 120 days. But then within 120 days, you have to ask again. And you got to keep doing that every 120 days. And they have to actually reject you. If they give you a response that says, thank you for applying for apprentices, we'll get back to you, then you don't meet the good faith effort. You have to get them to reply back in the negative or not reply at all to meet the good faith effort exception. So that concludes my presentation. If there's any questions, I open it up to questions. I'll leave it on this slide. On the right-hand side is, once again, an opportunity for you to request my slides. On the left-hand slide is a recording. I know that this recording will be available as well. But if you want an alternate recording that I gave months ago, obviously this recording will be better because it has the more up-to-date information. But if you just want a copy of the slides, don't hesitate to take a picture of this QR code or just send me an email at jacob.goldman@energytaxsavers.com. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thanks, Jacob. Good timing. We have 8 minutes left, so as they come in, we'll just get through what we can. Does the prevailing wager requirement apply to projects that were already completed in 2022?
No, it doesn't.
Do union apprenticeships programs typically qualify?
I do believe that is the belief, and everything I'm about to tell you is definitely anecdotal. I heard a rumor that there was a union that decided not to get their apprenticeship program registered. And therefore, those apprentices would be coming from a union, but would not be coming from a registered apprenticeship program. So it was just anecdotal. I heard it like third party. So I don't know that it's actually true. But union is, what is this prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirement all about? It's about, benefiting the union. So on a theoretical basis, the unions obviously are meeting prevailing wage. And then there's never been a national apprenticeship requirement. So any given state might have an apprenticeship requirement that could be a little different from a percentage standpoint. In general, I think unions are going to have the registered apprenticeship programs, but you're going to need to check that you can find that program on a list of registered apprenticeship programs.
So right now, that's all we're seeing for questions. I'll give it maybe another minute for any final questions to come in, and then we can wrap this up a few minutes early if possible before I turn it over to our moderator of the next session, which is at 10:45. Waiting. Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for taking your time today. Again, a few people asked if the slides will be available. Just to reiterate, use the QR codes, and we'll be sharing the recording of this after the conference.
Yeah, great. Just shoot me an email and I'll gladly send you a set of the slides.
Awesome. Well, Nick, do you think it's okay? We kind of went through all the questions during the presentation, so we can just wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely, Caitlin. We will I will take back control of the screen share for now.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Jacob, thank you.